Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and how are you guys doing? This is another session of Londoniyyah, and in fact it is the last session after 8 months of recording 2 sessions a week, many hours each session. We have finally concluded this series, and I think before we start the session and before I tell the Qari to read what he's going to read from the poem, I think I should mention something about how this all started, and why this started. And I think the barakah that could have come about because of the reason of how it started. Some months ago, maybe 9 months ago, something like that, I was in a hospital. I'm not sure if I even told you the story, but now it might be the first time I tell you this story. And I had blood clots. I had something called pulmonary embolism in the lungs, many of them. And as I was on the hospital bed, the doctor told me, you might go to sleep and not wake up. And he said, the mortality rate is about 50% for what you have. And it's something that we can't do anything about because they put you on blood thinners immediately. But they said, we have a duty to tell you this. And so obviously I started to think about it. I thought, obviously I have to leave will behind and all that kind of stuff, even though I don't have much things to contribute. But I left something behind, sorted out my will, and I encourage everyone to do the same thing here. If you haven't already done that, you have to have an Islamic will. I encourage everyone to do that. So I did that. I sorted out the will, and I said to myself, well, what have I left behind? And the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, where he said, يَنْقَطَعُ عَمَلُ بْنِ آدَمٍ إِلَّا مِنْ ثَلَاثٍ, that all of Bani Adam's amal is ceased except for 3 things. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said that وَلَدٌ صَالِحٌ يَدَعُ لَهُ, a child that you leave behind that he supplicates for you. وَصَدَقَةٌ جَارِيَةٌ, and a sadaqah which is continuous. It says عِلْمٌ نَافِعٌ يُنْتَفَعُ بِهِ, which is a beneficial knowledge that that you leave behind. Now it was not practical for that time for me to have any more children. So that was something I was not planning to do. And in terms of sadaqatun jariyah, you can only leave so much behind. That's depending on your wealth. At that time, I couldn't really do that much. But the thing that I thought about was ilmun nafa'un yantafa'u bih, that a beneficial knowledge that you leave behind. And I thought to myself, probably the best thing I could leave behind is not just debates online. It's not just these informal things that I go to Speaker's Corner or whatever it may be, podcasts or whatever. I thought the best thing is, what have I learned in all the years that I've been not just in the dawah but preparing for it? What have I learned? What have I been able to get from different people, different specialists that I have had the pleasure and honor of being able to work with? People like Sabur Ahmed, he's here today. Actually, he's a specialist in philosophy of biology, doing his PhD in it. People like Hamza Zorsis, who's also a specialist in philosophy, and others. In terms of the Islamic studies side, in the Shura. Other brothers that maybe don't want to be mentioned in the camera that are also here today. So I thought to myself, I put it all together and let's make something out of it. And the story was is that in the beginning I thought this was the plan, this was the idea. Abdurrahman was there, he remembers this quite vividly, I'm sure as well. The plan was to, in Islamic history, you've always had these kind of like poems for different funun, for different sciences, like Alfiyat ibn Malik, Tadmuriyah, Al-Hamawiyah, and it's usually named after the city that the person's in. Sometimes it can be, sometimes it's named after the person or the fen. But Ibn Taymiyyah had this idea of, when he went to a city, the poem would be named after that city, like Al-Hamawiyah and Hama, Tadmuriyah, Tadmur. These are all actual names of cities. So I decided to call it Londoniyyah, innit? Because Londoniyyah. So okay, we're in London, so the issues that affect us in London, because these are the new Aqidah issues that affect us in London. Obviously them, at that time, it was Mu'tazilism versus this. For us, it's feminism. For us, it's liberalism. For us, it's materialism. It's atheism. These are the big picture things that we need to focus on. So I started constructing a poem in Arabic language. And obviously, I'm not really the specialist in that. I'm no Sibawayh. I'm no Mutanabbi, I'm no these big poets. And there's rules in Arabic language to make poems. It's not just, you can just make any poem. You have to, it's like 16 bihar or buhur, different awzan, and this, it's very difficult. So I did it anyway. And I sent it to Abdul Rahman. I said, send it to your, because he had some, he had some scholars and teachers that were very good at poetry. So he went and sent it to some people. They said, no, this is not this does not fulfill the criterion. So I said, what do we do? Because, this was actually when I was on the deathbed. I said, this is not, I'm going to realize my dream here. So Sheikh Ali al-Qudaymi, who is a specialist in poetry and who actually wrote the Londoniyyah, he came forward and he kind of took out all the kind of information that we had. We had conversations with him in the part and quickly just understood everything and put it into poetry format. It was almost a miracle, the quickness by which he was able to make that transformation and able to do it. I was very surprised and very impressed. And that's how Londoniyyah came about. So it came about, I think it came about in a time where I was actually sincere. There's only a few times where I can tell you in my life that I've been sincere. that I can actually tell you. But when you're on your deathbed, that's one of the most sincere places that you can be, because you're thinking to yourself, you're going to die. You've got to lose something for the people. You have to, it's for your own grave and for your own self. And so what happened after that was, it became a Londoniyyah. And it was even ratified and given taqreed and tazkiyah and from big people like Ahmed Raisuni and other people from the Rabita Islamiyah, people all different kinds of. I was interested because people from all different kind of creedal backgrounds were accepting this poem. And it's been a long time since Ash'aris accept something and Atharis accept something, Maturidis, all of them accepted this, except not all of them, but there were people from each group that accepted this thing. So there was a lot of qabul, there was a lot of acceptance of this particular poem. And then I said to myself, well, the time is limited, I need to go through an explanation of it. So I put the proposal to Hamza Zosis, and then it became official. And we said it has to be an invite-only class because we can't just have anyone here. We brought the people that we thought would have the most effect in the future based on what they sent us and stuff like that. And 8 months later, I have to say, I am very impressed. I'm surprised at the extent to which people can transform. People coming in quite timid in the beginning, quiet mannered, well, that's good, but then now you're going into discussion with the brother, this one especially in the back here is trying to hide this guy who lives in a village all his life. This guy Furqan, for example, is a great example of that. He had the intelligence. Sorry, Mu'adh. Furqan as well. But you, Mu'adh, it's a great example of that, And you came in, you were a little bit, with your wording and stuff like that. And then afterwards, I see him on one of them. He's going against you. He's trying to cut you up and interject. And you remember that one? You remember that, don't you? We'll never forget that one. How about the time when Furqan was attacking us and playing devil's advocate and stuff like that? We wouldn't expect that from the first session. The transformation has been amazing. How do you agree? And this is exactly the dream. And now there's something that we can say is substantive that we leave behind, and we're the first batch of people to do it together. I don't see myself here as being some kind of a teacher. I'm just a facilitator here. And in fact, everyone has been teaching each other. People don't realize that, for the most part, these little lectures that we put forward is the tip of the iceberg of the interactions that we have in this class. And then after that, we have more interactions and stuff like that. And it's been amazing interactions where we've learned from each other. One thing I'll tell you never to learn from me is manners. This is the wrong person. That's why I never put myself in these kinds of positions. I've got a long way to go, and everyone knows that here. So just look to Tariq for that, please. Because I'll be honest with you, since we're in the process of talking about things, I've learned the most from this man here. Has been unbelievably generous, unbelievably honourable, the most punctual, the most I've learned more from him than he's learned from me. I promise you that, and I think all of us can attest to this reality, And so this has been something, wallahi, where it's been one of the most important projects I think I've ever undertook in my entire life. And I'm very happy that we have now reached the end of this series. And we're going to go into another series, which is going to be equally important, and another series after that. And after 4 or 5 of these series, you can imagine, with the Islamic studies that we're all doing on the side now, as well where we'll be in 2 or 3 years. We'll be in a position where we're all rounded. We'll be in a position where we transform ourselves. And I think this what's happening here is not happening anywhere else in the world. Not because of anything else, but the fact that we can facilitate certain things that other people in the world cannot facilitate. So this is a golden opportunity. This is such a golden opportunity that I can't even imagine anyone would voluntarily forego it. And that's why, to be fair, everyone that started practically has ended with us, which is a great sign that there's been valuation of knowledge from both sides. And of course, I'm not going to forget Carlos. How could I? And how could we? And you know, he's been the most professional. He's not just his editing, his graphics, but people don't realize that this man has facilitated discussion. You know, he's been himself the leader of discussions. He's facilitated guests. His contributions have been just about right. You know, not too antagonistic and not too passive. And so he's been, I consider him as a member of the team, actually. And I think all of you would agree with me and attest to that fact as well. And so I want to give everyone a thank you from in this class and to those who've been watching at home, because I know there's lots of people that will be watching at home who have also been benefiting us, because without them, any of this would not be possible anyway, let's be honest. The people watching at home, they're the lifeblood of the Sapience Institute. With that, the qari can begin, inshallah.
فصل في الرد على العنصريين والقوميين، ورد ما يدعو إليه العنصري وكل قومي غبي مفتري بأنه نبى نبيا جائيا إلى الجميع هاديا وداعيا، فليس من فضل لأبيض على أسود والعكس صريح يجتلى، وليس من فضل لعرب أدم على الذي للأعجميين انتمى.
And what powerful abiyat they were. We're not going to translate them exactly. We're going to have translations of the entire poem, and the poem is going to be published as well in the English and hopefully the Arabic as well. And the book will be, a sharh will be completely released about what we've discussed today in addition to these video materials. If you go on the group, you'll find as well the PowerPoint slides for today. They're not that many slides, only 8, because it's going to be discussion heavy. The first thing is these definitions, or the definition that I found was from Plato, the philosophy encyclopedia online. And the first thing we need to do is define what is nationalism. Nationalism is generally used to describe two phenomena. Okay, so nationalism is used to define or describe two phenomena. Number one, the attitude that members of a nation have when they care about their nation or national identity. And number two, the actions that the members of a nation take when seeking to achieve or sustain self-determination. Now, these are quite mundane descriptions. One may ask, what's the problem with nationalism? What is nationalism? We still may not even understand what nationalism is based on these descriptions. And we spoke about individualism versus collectivism in previous sessions. And who could summarize for us what the key distinctions between individualism and collectivism is? Yeah.
So individualism is basically about viewing the individual as the primary unit of analysis, whereas collectivism is you view social groups as primary.
Right. So now you've done right in being able to, but I would say this is still methodological individualism.
Yeah.
So how do we move it now into ethical kind of normative individualism?
Yeah, so then it becomes about which of those two things that you give primary consideration.
Beautiful. Okay. And what is nationalism, do you think?
So nationalism is basically it's a collectivism that's premised on the idea of a nation. So
beautiful.
That becomes a group of people.
Excellent. I want to start off by saying, and I actually was watching a podcast recently with someone who's unsuspecting to this discussion, but John Dana. We were talking about it before, wasn't it? And he said, he made a really good point. This guy's like a BJJ expert, but he's also a philosopher. He said, if you look at the human being, he said, yeah, if you look at the human being and compare it to other animals in the animal kingdom, like as the specs of the human being compared to the specs of the apex predators, the four-legged animal we're talking about, right? The lions and the cheetahs and then the human being doesn't square up that good at all. Like if the human being didn't have his intelligence and one other thing that we're going to talk about in a second, and they were left alone in the jungle or whatever it is, yeah, where would they really rank? They'd rank quite low. The only thing that we have as like, okay, kind of average, he stated, which is true, is endurance. But if a human being, I mean, we can fight a kangaroo. Like, have you seen fights between a human being and a kangaroo? Maybe you'll beat a kangaroo, maybe you'll lose. But going against a silverback ape, gorilla, or even probably a chimpanzee will beat you. I mean, a chihuahua will finish him. No, but it will take a grizzly bear, to deal with me, something like me. But what I'm saying is, where do we we're nothing. Like on the hierarchy of like physical attributes. But and he made this point, what has made the human being really what he is collaboration. Intelligence, yes, but collaboration number 2. If you think about this, like, we are the product of not just the groups that we've been able to form, but the collective knowledge that we've been able to access for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Like this phone that I hold in my hand is not just some guy from Samsung deciding that I've got all the technology here. He is building this phone based on technology which required like knowledge of mathematics, which we needed Al-Khwarizmi for, and these kind of mathematicians go before him to the Hellenistic period, the Greeks. We needed all of them. So we're always building on the shoulders of giants. What has made human beings successful and the top of the food chain, where they would have otherwise been nowhere near, even in the middle of the food chain, or maybe at the bottom of it, is the fact that we've been able to collaborate with one another. And politics is no different, because politicians have realized this reality, that one person's success is almost contingent on the success of the collective. And this continues being the case, and he made this point. It is especially the case even in sports. Even in sports. Even if it's an individual sport, ironically, even if it's an individual sport, you need to be in groups in order to progress. And he was saying he deals with an individual sport, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But people, in order to progress, they have to work as a group and share secrets together, share notes together, share ideas together, collaborate with one another. One person doing it is never enough. We're living in, especially nowadays, because we're living in an age of specialism. Al-Ghazali, and this is going a bit of a tangent, but he said something quite interesting and important. Al-Ghazali, he stated in one of his books, I can't remember which one, but he said, I studied philosophy for 2 years and I exhausted all the material that is out there. That's pretty ridiculous statement. It's ridiculous if you apply it to today's context, but at that time, there was only a limited amount of books that you could read. So you could actually exhaust the books in 2 years. You see, but now you cannot do that. No one can say to me, oh, in 2 years I've completed all philosophy. In 2 years I've completed anything, because we're living in an age of specialism. You need 10 years to be a specialist of one little thing. You go to a university, you'll find like there's a guy that's done a PhD on igneous rock and sedimentary rock. Let alone I'm a geology specialist. No, it doesn't work like that anymore. And in an age where that's the case, you need more people to come together. Now, politics and economics has found that out. Because in economics you have the law of comparative advantage. This is a very well-known law, where you have an advantage in making this product and I have an advantage of making that product, therefore we're going to both make our specialized products and then we're going to trade with one another. We're going to trade on that basis. Economies have become more specialized and they become more efficient and people make more money that way. Likewise, in politics, working together and a pure individualism is always going to be a failure. The reason why America is a superpower like no other today, despite having individualistic tendencies, strong individualistic traits, is because it's a nationalistic country. It's premised on nationalism. Nationalism, the flag, patriotism, our country. You go to any sporting event, what do they say? USA, USA, USA. They're really on that kind of thing. It's one team. They realize that. And I'll be honest with you, it makes a lot of sense. It makes practical sense, it makes economic sense, and it makes political sense. But as we'll find out from an Islamic perspective, we have another system. We have another system where the identity marker is not nation, number one. It's religion, number one. And we're going to come to that. And why that has meant that we can be even more successful, really. Putting people of different nationalities together. But having said that, the first question that we need to ask is what makes a nation itself. So here, this is mentioned, I'm taking it as an excerpt from the Plato. Nations and national identity may be defined in terms of common origin, ethnicity, or cultural ties. And while individual membership in the nation is often regarded as involuntary, it is sometimes regarded as voluntary. The degree of care for one's nation that nationalists require is often, but not always, taken to be very high. According to such views, it claims that one's nation takes precedence over rival contenders for authority and loyalty. In other words, the nation's number one. The nation has to be number one. In order for nationalism to be nationalism, it's not just that you have a regard for your country, that you care about your country, where you're from, or your people. That's something which the scope for in the Islamic discourse is the fact that you put it as number one. And so the first question I'm going to leave to the group is, we're looking at the definition of what it is to be a nation. What are the complications that arise with this definition? So I'll give you 2 minutes to speak to the person next to you. And there's 2 more questions. Is full statehood required? In other words, when I say that, we have 2 people that are from Kurdistan today. They don't really have a Kurdistan nation, as in the whole nation, right? You have some parts of it, which, but the entire thing is not a nation. It's a good example. Before 1948, the Jews were in a similar position. Okay? So do you need such a place in order for a nation to be defined? Or is a nation defined not in accordance with that? So it can be anything else. And the third question is, what is the difference between nationalism and patriotism? Because these are 2 words which are commonly used in conjunction with one another. Is there a difference? Where is the line of difference? So these are 3 questions. You can speak. I think we should do groups of 3 actually today. Let's do groups of 3. Speak to the person next to you and the person next to that person. And then after 5 to 7 minutes, we'll come back and discuss these questions. What I want to start off by saying is that, back in the days, we didn't have as many of these problems because tribalism is a little bit more straightforward than nationalism. Think about it, right? Tribalism is what your tribe is and what your lineage is. So it was easier to define. Like, my tribe that's a much more kind of straightforward concept. But the nation now has become such a complicated one comparative to that. And as a result, I think tribalism was a bigger problem than nationalism could be, because tribalism is it's so immediate. You come out, you see all the tribe there, your lineage, and then you're putting that ahead of everything else. That's what the Prophet has to do with. That is, and we're going to come to that in the end of this session. But having said that, question is on nationalism. What are some of the complications that go into the questions? What are some of the complications that one can think of?
Yeah. If you have a national identity, it's something that you need to, as a human being, you need to control, because it's a fine line between nationalism and it goes into racism.
Yep.
When you see yourself above other people. So, and me myself, it's something that is the biggest problem that I have as a person, is nationalism. Because it can bubble over into something that's unpleasant. So that's my biggest challenge as a human being, is to control that within an Islamic framework, for me personally.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very honest of you to say that as well. And we will come to the fact that it's not a problem to identify with your country and race as well, and to love a certain place more than another place. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ, he made dua to love Medina like he loves Mecca. So he had preferences. People that have certain cultural and geographic affinities, they're not the ones who are lambasted from the Islamic discourse or otherwise shunned. We'll come to exactly the Islamic side in what follows. It's really those who prioritize the nation above the religion. It's categorically the most problematic thing that we can find. And it was an issue at the time of the Prophet that he dealt with himself. So there's very specific guidance on this thing. But going back to the questions, and thank you for that contribution. First question was, what are some of the complications that arise with that definition? So the definition of nationalism that we talked about. And if you want to see the definition, you can look at it. There's 2 parts there. Yeah.
So first of all, it's very broad. It's a very broad definition.
Yeah.
Second of all, it says how it may be to do with ethnicity or ethnic origin. And once again, if you look at America and you consider it a nation, you have African Americans, you have Native Americans, or Red Indians, whatever you want to call them. You got a vast amount of different ethnic groups. If we're gonna really boil down to it,
Good point.
But at the same time, it's all considered the same nation, so they would all attribute themselves to USA.
It's a good point. And you know, in America, they have a program. You'll be very surprised the words that in the political discourse that people use. So you'll be surprised that in England and the UK and Western countries, they call it integration. So when someone comes from another country, they need to integrate into our value system. Whereas in America, it's not really integration, it's assimilation. And so if you go to America and you speak to a black man, you'll say, where are you from? He'll say Philadelphia. He doesn't understand the question. I said, where are you originally from? He doesn't know. Because he has been assimilated to the point of not knowing where his heritage is. If you ask a black man in this country, where are you from? He'll say, I'm from Nigeria, I'm from the Igbo tribe, I'm from this and that, and he'll sub, he'll know everything, right? There's a big difference here. And obviously there's a colonial and a slavery legacy that happened in America, which didn't happen in the UK in exactly the same way, that defines that kind of thing. But it's also to do with this idea of assimilation. The Americans, because they realize that the success of their nation, although they're individualists in some senses, but the continued success of their nation as a superpower depends on a national identity. So they have a very strong culture of assimilation. By the way, this is very important for us as Muslims, because you'll find that Muslim communities, for example, are more strongly affected by this kind of thing. So you'll find, for example, Muslim scholars and clerics making a big thing about being an American. You don't find the same kind of thing in the English discourse, British discourse. Yeah, for example, we've kind of identified this ourselves. You never really find Union Jack flags in the streets in London, for example, unless England is playing football, or England flags. And where we do find England flags, it's usually far right and all these kind of things. And let's be honest, in America that's not the case. In America, the flag is actually in every school, and is seen as a staple part of American life. The national anthem is part of the school. You wake up, you have to give allegiance to the flag. You have to give flag burning in America is not like flag burning in England. Both are problematic. I mean, I'm not saying, but in America, if you go to some areas and you flag burn, you're putting your life in danger. When in England, if you do it in the centre of London, you will maybe be attacked and assaulted, possibly, but most people will just leave it. And there's a reason for that. It's because the nation, the assimilation, the theory or the theme of assimilation in America is much stronger, and they did that on purpose. And they connected with it, and I'm not sure if you know this, they connected with the other themes and theories, the like of which, for example, I'm not sure if you guys have heard of manifest destiny. Have you heard of this? Manifest destiny is an idea and the westward expansion. Two ideas connected to American nationalism. Manifest destiny is like literally, it's our destiny as Americans to take over the world. And it might surprise you to realize that every American president has believed in manifest destiny. Every single American, explicitly or implicitly, believes in manifest destiny. Moreover, westward expansion is because when America first came into, when the colonizers or white men came into America, and the Red Indians and so on, they were expanding westward. So this idea of westward expansion is like spreading American culture by the sword. They all believe in this thing. Every single president in American history believes. Why? Because for them, it's not just a matter of being a nation, defending itself, but it's also expanding across the world. Which, of course, when we go back to like human rights and state sovereignty and democracy and self-determination, these concepts of American nationalism fly in the face of these things. So yeah, I think that's a very good point about assimilation, about what is it in fact anyway, because if it's to do with ethnicity, it's a good point. How far back do we go? How far back do we go? And this is where especially right-wing types, they find it very difficult. 5 generations, they say, 3 generations. Oh, who determines that? Who determines that, And what is it, the whiter you are, the more British you are? Like, they really struggle on these questions. They do. What if you're half? What if you're mixed race? They struggle on these questions. There are some, like, let me give you another example in the British context. We've seen what happened when England played in the European Cup. Look at the racism that took to the black players. Imagine if there was a Muslim black player or a Muslim Asian player. Imagine you have like this guy who's the cricketer, Moeen Ali. Imagine we had the Moeen Ali type in the England squad. I don't know how they would react. Maybe they wouldn't accept him at all. They'd completely refuse. Because, why should he represent England? Take Amir Khan, Pakistani boxer. How much support does he get from English fans compared to Ricky Hatton? Compare him with AJ. AJ gets more support than Amir Khan. He's mixed race, or he's black actually. So what's going on here? How do you define a British person? A lot of it is arbitrary, and it boils down to the subjective preferences of certain groups. We'll accept you as part of the nation, we won't accept you. And ethnicity does have a big part to play. Another thing that has a big part to play is borders. Now, let's have a conversation about borders. What do you think the issue of borders is? Yes.
Yeah, so it was sort of related to what we were talking about, which is that, you know, when you're saying that tribalism is a bit more straightforward because it's based very much on exactly who you're related to, and you can track the family and the lineage and the line and that type of thing. With a lot of the nations that we're dealing with currently, obviously it might not exactly be the case with America because their inception was a bit different, but certainly for a lot of the countries in, let's say, the areas that used to be colonized, the current borders that they have are very arbitrary. And so it's a bit weird because you have like an affinity to basically a patch of land that was arbitrarily placed, like, you know, by Western powers like Sykes-Picot and all that kind of stuff that took place in the 20th century. So it was an agreement between, I believe, basically like there's a British and a French foreign ministers, I believe they were, and it was basically after the during the decolonial period in the mid 20th century in Asia and other areas. They basically they sat down at a map and they started basically drawing the lines of how they wanted to break up the lands and stuff like that. And they did it very strategically. So they took tribes that they knew basically had problems and that type of thing, and they put them all in the same area, and they did that kind of stuff in order to maintain control of those areas. So it's a big problem for nationalism, I think, in those areas.
It is. I mean, a lot of the flag, the Palestinian flag, the Egyptian flag, all the flags with red, white and black were put in place by the Western powers. Almost all the flags in the Arab world, in fact, I mean, were put in place like that by Western powers, almost all of them, with no exception. So the flag, and a flag is a great symbol for a nation. It's just been put in, the irony of it being put in place by white men. And then, you know, but again, the question of borders. I had a conversation with an Egyptian nationalist one time who explicitly told me that he says that the nation should be before the religion, which is a statement of disbelief, really. Like, how does that even make sense? Well, when you're in your grave, when the angel asks you, Man Rabbuk, you're not going to say, Tahya Masr. You know, you're not going to say that. So the point, which is a phrase we use, let Egypt live, you know, so in Egypt, where I'm from. I said to him, if everyone in Egypt were to relocate to Algeria, and everyone in Algeria went to Egypt, would Egypt now be called Egypt and Algeria? Would we change the names on the map? And he was so disturbed by that question. He went to his wife. You can see him almost sweating, because it kind of, for him, it was like cognitive dissonance. He didn't know what to do with it. And then he started thinking, and then he ate food, and then he came back and he kept changing his answers. Yes, no, yes, no. But his wife was disagreeing with him at one point. They're both the same, by the way. She was like, no, Egypt is mentioned in the Quran. It's about the land. It's not about the people. He was like, no, it's not about because Egypt is mentioned in the Quran, but it included Sudan. Do you know what I mean? No, Egypt includes Sudan at that time. So, okay, but this and that. And those people, those ancient Egyptians, didn't look anything like us modern Egyptians. Let's be honest. Look at Tutankhamun. He's a black man. He was, you know, flatter nose and this kind of thing, and darker. You can't see his color, but you can tell that he wasn't the same. More like the southern Egyptians now. Okay, say again. Nubians, yeah. No, there was another province, Nubia, where the Egyptians were. But even the ancient Egyptians themselves. But what I'm saying is that, what is it then to be? And you know, he was disturbed by the question. But it makes you think. It makes you think, because, you know, what does it mean to be an Egyptian? What, speak Egyptian Arabic? So what if all of the people in Algeria start speaking Egyptian Arabic, they become Egyptians? Is it to eat the koshari, which is not really a nice meal anyway, to be honest with you? I mean, someone like, I don't mind it, it's fine, it's okay, but it's not in the top 10 of any dishes in the world. What is it then? What does it mean to make an Egyptian? And then he was confused and all that kind of thing. So where do we start the clock? Because if we go before the Arab invasion or the Islamic conquests, well, we don't call it, the Orientalists would call it the Arab invasion. Then you had the Aqbat. They were a significant force there, the Copts. The Ammiya Egyptian that we speak is a combination of Coptic language and Arabic language and other languages. So what the Egyptians, and you know, it becomes ridiculous. It becomes ridiculous because I'm not sure if you know this. Ramses II was discovered at the time of the Sadat. Sadat was the president in the 1970s in Egypt, after Gamal Abdel Nasser and before Hosni Mubarak. And there's parts of the Egyptian nationalist project which are so against Islam. For example, the Egyptian national team, which I have to put my hands up and say I do support. Although yesterday they let us down, but I felt good for Senegal because they were 95% Muslim. We discovered they're a Muslim nation, very good people. I felt kind of sorry for them, let them have it the first time, no problem. Sadio Mane walking around arrogantly like that. Anyway, that's no problem. It was good. But the point is, they call themselves the young pharaohs, which is totally against Islam. Sadat, the president, he put in Ramses II. Okay, he gave him he gave him the red carpet. Most historians say Ramses II was the pharaoh of the Quran. The strongest proof, we went through this I think before. The strongest proof is that Ramses II was the pharaoh. He gave him the red carpet and he sent him off to France. So you're sending off the person who, in the Quranic discourse, is the archetypal antagonist, and giving him respect because he's Egyptian. Whereas if you saw him, he probably was a black man that you would say, actually Sadat was quite black himself, to be fair. But you see the point. It's something which boggles the mind, and something which causes confusion, causes cognitive dissonance, causing all kinds of problems. And of course, the Egyptian nationalist project and the Arab nationalist project was one of the biggest failures in history. And that's another conversation for another day. But the point I'm making is that how do you define it? There's serious complications with defining who your people are in the first place. Who are your people? Real problems. And it becomes even more pathetic, quite frankly. So it's the Somalis here in the room, so I might as well just let's talk about Egyptians. Let's talk about Somalis for a little bit. When the Italians came, when I was doing a history master's in university, there was a white man, professor, very middle class guy, and he was talking about Somalia. And he was he was kind of like, I'm not sure if I told you this before, but he was like, and when the colonizing powers, they were squabbling over Somalia. He used the formal name the first time. He's talking about, obviously, Somalia was split between, as you know, the so-called Somaliland and the rest of Somalia, which is a nonsense split, and people are falling for it and fighting each other over it. And he said, and then the second time he mentioned the word Somalia, he didn't mention the word Somalia. Do you know what he said? So when they were fighting over the crumbs of Africa, they and continue the conversation. The crumbs of Africa, he called it. I'll never forget this. You see how they think of it. We went to the crumbs of Africa. He had the same colonial mindset, put a line, and these guys let them fight each other like animals. And now I used to tutor the Somali community. At one time I went to a Somali person's house. And this is a true story. Someone came out of the house. We were looking through the window. And he said, "You see that guy there?" I said, "Yeah, I looked at him. He said, "I see him, yeah." He said, "If I was in Somalia, I'd kill him." I said, "Why?" He said, "From a different tribe, different this." I said, "You're a crazy guy, man." He still had it. He literally said, "If we were in Somalia, I would kill him." That's what he said to me. I remember the exact words. And I looked at his face to see if he was joking. And there was no laughing. There was no laughing matter for the man. If he was in the crumbs of Africa, he would have. I'm joking. The point is this: is that it's ridiculous that how partisan we can become on these matters. And so now people say, "I'm from Somaliland." No, I'm from Hargeisa. I'm not from Mogadishu. I'm not from this. And then they go into more details and say, "No, I'm from this tribe. I'm from that tribe. I'm from Reer Fech. I'm Barao. I don't know what you are. Don't care. Doesn't matter." And it becomes, because some people are confused. They don't even know where they are. Where they are. This Barawa tribe. I have a family member from that. And is he Kenyan? Is he Somalian? Is he Yemeni? Or is he all of it? I just don't know. But one thing you do know is you're a Muslim, right? So let's stick with that which we do know. Is full statehood required? And so obviously, the Jewish nation was a Jewish nation for thousands of years, and for a long time they didn't have a state. The fact that the Jews, many Jews, who have formulated Zionism, almost make it a prerequisite for them to have a state, could be said to be an indication that there's an inferiority complex that they have, that without a state we wouldn't be a people. Is that what is required? So you need a patch of land, and it has to be this state, and it has to be in this area, and it has to be. So that means that without the state, you would not be. Without the land, you would not be a people. Without the land, what's so special about that land? Well, for them, obviously, there's religious significance. But what about the atheist Zionist? He still makes the argument. Secular Zionists, they still make the argument, but they make it on the matter of self-determination. Anyway, no problem. I'm not saying it's a completely invalid argument, but I'm saying it is one that is easily confused. So, in fact, talking about arguments, what I want you to do, okay, with the person next to you, in the next two slides you have some of the main arguments for nationalism. I want you to read them and summarize them, and someone's going to, so actually look, group 1, this is group 1, 1, 2, 3, you're group 1, yeah? 1, 2, 3, you're group 2, 1, 2, 3, you're group 3, 1, 2, 3, you're group 4, and 1, 2, 3, you're group 5. Was it? Did I say 5? Is that right? So what group are you? What group are you? What group are you? What group are you?
4.
And are you, who's group 5? Is there a group 5? 1, 2. Okay. Can you do 2? Can group 5 do 2? Because there's not, yeah. So summarize each argument. These are the arguments for nationalism. So you just deal with the first, the second, the third, and so on. And then we'll come back, we'll summarize the arguments, and then we'll do arguments against together collectively. We'll look at a few hadith and we'll call it a day. Okay? Alright, go ahead. Alright, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back. Let's quickly look at the first, group 1. Let's look at the first thing that we've got here. So this is the argument from intrinsic value. Who wants to summarize that from your group?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah.
So the argument from intrinsic value, it seems to be saying that if two groups of people, or two people, they have common cultural proximity, which basically means like they share similar ethos, similar values, similar cultures, then they should work together to protect these kind of meanings, values, and ethos.
Yeah.
Because these things are valuable and they need to be protected and they need to be preserved. So I think this seems to be what the argument from intrinsic value is.
And what do you think of that? What's your value judgment of that? Is there merit in that argument?
I don't think so. I think, to say that we share these common values and they need to they need to be protected. Like, I think you first need to justify like that these values are actually good, that these values deserve to be preserved and transmitted further on down the line.
That's a good point. So you would say that no problem. That is true, but you'd have to prove that these values that you're talking about, or these things in particular, are worthy of protection. Obviously, the foremost among the things that should be, could be arguably protected is language itself. So if people don't speak this was a big deal in Turkey. Ataturk obviously done what he done, but Erdogan, even people that are considered Islamists and stuff like that, they make a big emphasis on the Turkish language. Because if Turkish people are not going to preserve the Turkish language, the Turkish language will not be preserved. And it was a big issue as well with Jews. When they started off the so-called State of Israel, it was a huge issue to try and kind of bring back the language. Language is huge. It's one of the biggest, it's probably the number one thing which it makes sense to preserve. It does make sense to preserve it. Because, but then the question will be, what languages are more worthy of being preserved than others? What of a language that's not being in use at the moment, or doesn't access you to any of the world's civilizational history? What use is that language? Like, for example, now people study Latin, yeah? It's a dead language conversationally, but it's not dead in terms of being able to access primary sources that can get us closer to whatever it is in knowing things about human civilization. So you can see, and this goes back, interestingly, to what this Marxist was talking about before, use value, right? How useful is this language? How useful is this language? You know, even being able to speak to your grandparents and your tribes members, that might be very useful. So preserving a language is not necessarily a wrong thing from the Islamic perspective. But the question is, how useful is it in the first place? And what languages need to be preserved more than others? And these are very important questions. But yeah, it's very important that we don't come across as nullifying all of these arguments, because there are some aspects, food, for example. I think we all appreciate a good meal, especially me. You know, if someone has a good, you know, where's that come from? It comes from, it's passed on generation after generation. And a nation has a good recipe because of its geographic landscape. You know, what spices are available in that place, and so on. So they pass on recipes, and that they say, this is important to us, we want to keep this. You know, or a way of marriage, or this or that, certain ceremonies, or certain clothing people wear. And we wouldn't have necessarily a problem with any of that stuff. But the question goes back to value, comes back to use. Anything else you want to say?
Yeah, just going to say on the language point here, I think there's lessons to take from the way that the Muslims dealt with this issue. Because obviously what's going to happen is, if when you have, like, in the early period of Islam, when you had more people coming into Islam, and then the Arabic language obviously becomes, as far as like people begin to make more mistakes than language and that type of thing. But the Muslim response wasn't to then say, therefore we're going to kind of close off I guess Islam ethnically and not allow non-Arabs to come in. It was more to kind of codify the rules of the language from that standpoint. So the preservation of the language doesn't have to be based on, like, you know, keeping it quote-unquote ethnically pure. You can preserve it in other ways.
And it wasn't also a matter of you have to learn Arabic and only speak in Arabic. You can speak your own national language. So, and the Quran mentions this quite explicitly, in fact. ومن آياته اختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم, right? اختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم. That from his signs is the differences in colors and your languages. So if Allah wanted to do away with that aspect of things, then so this aspect, basically what should be challenged here, I think, and going with the challenge, is that this does not need to happen within a nationalistic framework. So preservation of things which you think are culturally acceptable can happen in a framework which is more meta than a nationalistic framework. It can still be like that. A federalized so-called framework. You know, where you have something else which defines the human as number one, but these things are secondary considerations and also acceptable. So nationalism, the assumption here is that nationalism is either the best thing to preserve these things or the only thing to preserve these things. We say neither of those things are legitimate. Because if you come from a small nation, think of it, right? If you come from a very small nation with very small number of population, for example, Norway, if you've got 5 million or 6 million people or something, right? They speak the Norwegian language. I mean, it's a strong nation in terms of economics and stuff, but if Russia wants to overtake it, it's finished, it's done. The only thing that's stopping that is NATO and the UN and all these things. But, you know, if Russia, it says, good, we want to overtake this nation. I mean, Russia is protecting Norway. Without Russia, Norway would be finished, would be done. It's too small. But if Norway was part of Russia, and this was the kind of like idea of the Soviet Union, in a sense, they made an argument. They said that if you're part of us, we can defend you better. And therefore your languages and your customs and all that, that can be preserved in a better way. You see. And so in many ways, Norway, for the record, was never part of the Soviet Union, but the idea is, what I'm saying is, it's not always the case that the nation itself is the best protector of itself. If it's a small, weak nation with a small population, then sometimes it makes sense for it to be seeded into a bigger nation, which doesn't have nationalism as its focus, but which can protect it in a better way. Basically, is the point. So the assumption that you need to have a national identity and nationalism, and the state-centered nationalism is the best way to preserve language or food or dress codes, or that's can be refuted. The second argument.
Yes, the argument for flourishing.
Yes.
From flourishing. Basically, it's a kind of tribal argument again, where they consider it essential for a group of people who share ethnicity, that only within that particular ethnicity can it's the best environment for them as a people to flourish and to progress, because everybody's got a national interest. You're working for the collective, the tribe, to progress and But the obviously the argument against that would be America, because you have different ethnicities working together under the flag, as I understand this.
Yeah. And taken to its radical conclusion, this could mean for a kind of economic isolationism. Now, America in the 20s and 30s did have that program, did have they called it isolationism, literally. But now this kind of thing is less and less likely because of the globalized world. And because you can't produce everything in your own nation. Only a few countries in the world can produce everything in its own nation. America is actually one of them, that can produce a lot of stuff in its own nation because of the size of it. But not every country has a geographic landscape the size of America. Not every country can implement isolationist economic measures. Not every country, if it does do that, will even survive as a country. It's impossible. So everything must be kind of seen as in the context of the wider world community. And so absolutely, I think you're right on your analysis there. Any other points on this argument? Okay, the third one, please.
It's called the argument from the right to collective self-determination. I think it's very similar to the previous arguments, but it's on a more fundamental level. So the argument is it basically makes sense for a group of people to come together and work towards their collective interest together and build cultural institutions based on what their interests are. So yeah, I think that's the only claim that they seem to be making here. And if that's the only thing that the claim that they're making, I don't see anything wrong with that. I think as Muslims we believe in a similar idea as well, right? We believe in Muslims coming together and protecting our own interests by having a caliphate.
Yep.
Yeah, but then the question rises: how do we determine what the group should be? What should it be predicated on? Should it be biological traits or should it be a set of values? And if so, how do we select the set of values?
That's very well said. I think it's a good summary. What I will say is that the issue would come of tension if the national self-determination project supersedes the religious one. This is always the problem, right? Because remember, Islam did come to unite the tribes under the banner of Tawheed, of monotheism. And remember, this is a rights-based argument. Rights-based argument are saying you have an intrinsic right of this and intrinsic right of that. So all of these have assumptions. The question is, why do you have any rights whatsoever? What is the evidence that you have any rights whatsoever? And so these are assumptions that can easily be kind of looked at. Thirdly, I would say that when you talk about self-determination, who's included in that? And I think you've kind of touched upon this. Who would be included in that? Who's excluded from it? And then you ask the question: and who's a real citizen, and who's not a real citizen? Who should vote? Maybe. I mean, people in this country can't vote if they're in prison. I'm not sure if you know this. They can't vote if they're 16 to 18, although they can have sex at that time and they can be charged for murder at that time. Why not? Whatever the question would be. So these questions would be there. And so the right to self-determination, there you have it. These are the issues with it, right? So why should we have a right in the first place? Of course, this is a difficult one for anyone who wants to make the argument. But we would say as Muslims, obviously, the most important thing is religious identity. It's really as simple as that. We have our own evidences for that. But otherwise, it makes sense for them. Secularists, atheists, it makes sense for them to say something like this. Because, once again, if the assumption is we work better in groups than we do as individuals, then yeah, I get it. I fully understand it. But obviously, from our perspective, we have to kind of clarify the position. All right, the fourth argument.
So the fourth argument was the argument from the right to self-defense and to redress past injustices. And essentially what it was referring to was if you have a majority group and a minority group within the same nation, within the same country, and the majority group were oppressing the minority group, that the country or the nation would intervene and would say, no, under the banner of the nation or under the banner of the country, we are all one, and so this shouldn't take place. Take, for example, Egypt. You have a minority group of Christians and a majority group of Muslims. If it was the case that the Muslims were oppressing the Christians, the nation would intervene and would say, no, under the banner of Egypt, as being Masriyin, being Egyptians, we are all to be treated the same, we all to have the same rights as one another. Now obviously there's nothing wrong in that, but I think we have the same, if not the better system in Islam. Lakum dinukum waliya din, to use your religion and to us as ours. Clear cut, you're allowed to practice your own faith. فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. Whoever wishes they can believe and whoever wishes they can disbelieve. Essentially showing tolerance towards allowance to follow whatever faith you want. Also, it shouldn't be under the banner of under the banner of nationalism, under the banner of being Egyptian. That's why we should be fair. It's a humane thing. It's something which is just common sense humanity. That as humans, there should be this level of respect to one another, and no
I think
oppression.
this is a really powerful point. That last point you made, and I think all the points you made were very good. But do you know when we say, or when liberals say, not us, let's just say liberals say, or many people who cosmopolitanists or whoever they be, yeah, if they say we believe that one life, all lives are equal, all lives are, you've heard this. Of course, this is the assumption of liberalism, all created equally and so on. But this is where it becomes murky water for a nationalist liberal. Because for a nationalist liberal, if you're in America, and it really boiled down to it, it's either going to be your people are going to get killed, or the Vietnamese are going to get killed. Your people are going to get killed, or the Afghanistanis are going to get killed. We don't find people saying, their lives are more important than ours. This is not the argument that's usually made. When it boils down to it, for example, in an even stronger example of this possibly is World War II itself. Liberals and others, Democrats and people who define themselves in these ways, we're not saying let's stop the war, because especially when, they were targeted civilians. I'm not sure if you guys know, Dresden and Hamburg. Dresden and Hamburg are two towns in Germany, where Winston Churchill was specifically targeting civilian people, the RAF. The Royal Air Force of England. The campaign was to kill civilians. Can you imagine this? The campaign was to kill civilians in these two places. You didn't see too much uproar. But why? I thought all lives were equal. Well, because now they all have consequentialist reasoning. John Rawls himself, a liberal, one of the most important ones, in fact, he spoke about collateral damage and killing civilians and stuff like that for consequentialist reasons. And now when you combine consequentialism with nationalism, then you have not all lives are equal. That's the result. Let me say that one more time. If you combine nationalism, our nation, with consequentialism, these people should be, in this case, dead in order to save the majority, then it's resultant in basically inequality. And so it defies the other values. It defies the values of the liberals and other spaces. So nationalism and liberalism are incompatible in many ways. Very incompatible. Obviously, we saw in World War I and II, the nationalist product, and people saw this. And that's why George Orwell, for example, very famous essay that he wrote in 1945 on nationalism, and many other people, the nationalist product, it led to illiberal results. And that's the reason why they had the United Nations. The United Nations was called the League of Nations in the beginning. I'm not sure if many of you know this. It was called the League of Nations, and then it transferred, or became, therefore, after 1945, the United Nations. And the idea is that we've learned our lessons from all being nationalists, German nationalism, French nationalism, British nationalism, and now we have to decide to work together. So the dominant theme, the nationalist dominant theme dampened, and the cosmopolitan, universalist national theme started to become bolstered. But unfortunately now it's headed or spearheaded by the superpower, which is America. And so the UN is just an extension of the American project. Just like the WHO is, just like the IMF is, just like almost all the world organizations are. So you've replaced nationalism with a supra-nationalist program of American nationalism disguised as universalism. Even big countries like Russia and China, in population and in strength, physical strength, military strength, are totally underrepresented. We don't like Chinese or government programs or whatever, but we're just being open about this. They're totally unrepresented, disproportionately, comparative to the Americans in the United Nations Security Council and in the UN in particular. Like, their vote is not the same. And the reason why is because, well, they have the hegemony. I was even looking at something yesterday. I know this might be off topic, but it is FIFA. You know, I was looking at how many nations. Why is it that the African nations have never even reached the semi-finals? It's been going on for years now, this FIFA World Cup. Why? Is it because, are we that bad? Oh, right, we're doing okay in the African nation. And I realized that FIFA only allows 5 African nations to come through, where they allow 13 European nations to come through. So it gives the, if you have 13 European nations and 5 African nations, then obviously it's giving more chance to the Europeans to be successful. And they ask why no African team has made it to the semi-finals and the finals. Well, it's because they don't have equal representation. Look at the Egypt and Senegal situation. They were the 2 finalists of the African nations. They have to face each other off to see which of the 2 go to the World Cup. And they're the 2 best nations in the World Cup. So one of them has to be eliminated. It makes no sense. They'll ask why now that this is happening. So it gives the false impression that Europeans and white people are doing better than the rest of the world. Well, they've been given less opportunity in the first place. Same thing with Nobel Peace Prizes. Who are the nominees? There's a man now in Ethiopia who's he's in war. He's the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm not saying, I'm not taking the side, whatever. But he's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. What's his name? Ahmed Abuja, what's his name? He's a Nobel Peace, what's his name? I can't remember his name. This guy is a Nobel Peace Prize. He's in a civil war. It's what an ironic situation that is. Because he toes the liberal line. Whoever toes the liberal line gets the prize. So it makes it seem as if Europeans keep winning the best. But it's because it's a failed race. And it's American universalism, disguised as Americans doing very well in sports and in the intellectual spheres and so on and so forth. Sometimes it's true. I mean, I'm not saying that they don't do that. They're doing really well in science. They're doing really well in technology. They're doing really well in taking other people's lands and using their minerals. And they're doing really well in getting STDs as well. and these kinds of diseases. Or as Carl Jung said, they have become technological giants but moral dwarfs. Right, this is the Western project in a nutshell, really. But anyway, the point is that since the nationalist project has somewhat been now transferred to the universalist, globalized, American superpower project, which still makes it seem like all these other countries have self-determination, it just makes the results, the global results, look skewed. Look at the IMF. Look how many loans are given to African countries. African countries, right, which they can never pay back. They have to pay them back over 100 years or something. Ridiculous. It's a different kind, it's a pernicious and malignant type of hegemony. It's the New World Order. And this is no conspiracy theory. What's the last thing that we want to speak about here? Argument from equality. Who wants to cover that? Is it you?
Yeah. Yeah, so this argument is basically saying that you're going to have minority groups of people, and in the interest of basically promoting liberal neutrality, the majority should make provisions or should cater for those minority populations, which, on the face of it, I guess is not the worst argument. That if people are in a precarious situation, that they should be specifically catered for. You can make an argument for that. Of course, in this case, they're basing that on liberal neutrality, which is where we get all of the questions previously about values and that type of thing. And also, the second objection would be that nationalism isn't a necessary condition to have that type of thing. So you could ask, you could request that you have your specific interests catered for, without expressing that in a nationalistic way.
Beautiful, excellent. I like that. And this, what you just said at the end there, is something which you can say for all the arguments. That it's almost as if they're saying nationalism is the only way you can achieve this, and that's an assumption that can never be justified, because there are other collectivist projects. If all you're really saying is collectivism is the way, has these benefits. Okay, collectivism doesn't have to be based on nationalistic lines. And the last one, do you want to cover that as well?
Yeah, but just to add one more thing onto the previous point as well, is that when you do make that argument to say that we should have a specific type of thing because of us and our nation, then it lends very easily to like a race-based argument, because then you've sort of distinguished yourselves
I'm happy you mentioned
on the basis of your race. In any case, the final argument was basically the argument from success, which is basically that when people have been put into nations, they have been more successful. Which I think that's such a bad argument. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, it's better than being in an anarchic state. in terms of achieving
Yeah,
things.
yeah, of course. But then it's to say as if that I guess being like every nation state is going to be successful.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of failed nation states. There's plenty of
Exactly,
nation
that means
states
that you're giving preference to nations which have more population, more technology, more resources. Ask a question. Why is Europe, although they have been, we talked about how it's misappropriated sometimes and misinterpreted or skewed sometimes. We talked about the Nobel Peace Prize and all this kind of thing. But in other senses, we can't deny that Europe has succeeded economically, technologically and scientifically. The question is, why is that the case? And when was that the case? When did the Muslims, for example, the superpower of Islam, start diminishing? When did the European project start to increase? The answer to that question, a lot of it is actually based on natural resources. So for example, in Britain, in the UK, you had something called the Industrial Revolution. There's three things you should be very well aware of in the European context. Number one is the Renaissance period. Okay? Number two is the Enlightenment period. I would put to that as well, add to that, the Scientific Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. These four things you need to know about them. Okay? You need to know about them. I'm going to say that one more time. The Renaissance period, the Enlightenment period, the Scientific Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. And if you want to add a fifth, it will be the discovery of new land, which in this case was the Americas, which conveniently some of it was referred to as newfound land. If you go on the map now, if you look at it like Canada on the map, there's actually a patch of the map called Newfoundland because they found it newly. Why do you think New York is called New York? Because we have a York here in England and they just made it called New York, the new one. There's London here, there's London in Canada. Why is that? Because they just copy names. They found land and they went there and they just, Anyway, these five things are important because some of those things are circumstantial, some of them are borrowed, some of them is to do with the good work of the European people in a certain time, collaborative work, and some of it is exploitative. So, for example, if we're looking at the scientific revolution, I'm not sure if you know this. I've done some work on this. In fact, you'll find in the 16th century, when the scientific revolution happened, they say it's when Galileo, found the heliocentric model. They start the clock then. But really, if you look at the time before and after that time, it was because of weaponry, ballistic weapons and stuff like that. They were looking for things to... science became a big thing, basically, in universities. It was never called science before. It was called natural philosophy. So it only started to become called science in the 16th to 17th century. And the reason why it became, where science became departments and started to expand, is because they were looking for ballistic missiles and weaponry, and because weaponry started to expand. And they say necessity is the mother of all invention. Or in Arabic they say al-hajat al-ikhtira'. Necessity is the mother of all invention. So because it's to do with war, science actually really took a bolstering when they decided, okay, we need this for the progress of our nation. In regards to the newfound lands, it was because of their adventures, European adventures. And you may have known this or studied this in America in a school, that when the expeditions took place and they went and Elizabeth, who died 1603, she decided to send this person and that person afterward. They found the land and they literally settled there. It was because of their explorative efforts, but then what happened afterwards was exploitative westward expansion and so on. And then we're talking about Industrial Revolution. In England, the Industrial Revolution started because one of the main reasons, I'm not sure if you know this, but there's coal in Britain. Coal. Britain is a coal-rich country. And because then they started doing the steam train, all this kind of, literally because of what was under their ground. You don't have coal in all the countries in the world, but you do have it in Britain. So they were able to do steam trains and all these kinds of things. But the nationalist project now, and the Enlightenment period, to be honest with you, they didn't really contribute anything by way of technology. It was probably the weakest of all four things I've mentioned, or five things I've mentioned, because they had all these ideologies they brought out. But it made it seem as if these ideologies coincided with the scientific progress, and it made it seem like there was a correlation, there is no correlation. I mean, there is no causation. There might be a correlation, but there's no causation. But the point is that when you think about it, these five things, which meant that the Western European countries and their extensions, which in this case was America, these things which took place, combined with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which really was already happening. I don't want to go into expansive detail, but it was happening in the 18th to 19th century. But really started happening in the mid-19th century, where something called the Tanzimat happened in Turkey, in the Ottoman. Tanzimat is when the parliament and so on, they become westernized. And then in the early 1900s, unfortunately, honestly, this is a serious thing. Nationalism could be argued to be historically to be the number one contributor for the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and therefore the disintegration of all the nations within it. Because I mean, you've heard of Lawrence of Arabia and all these kind of things. The Ottomans, the Turks. You are Turkish. These are Arabs. You should be celebrating your Turkish identity and going against these. And they literally went into clash, the Arabs and Turks. The moment the Arabs and Turks went into clash with one another, it signaled the end of the Ottoman Empire. That combined with the fact that you had now leadership of Ataturk in the early 20th century, and he emphasized the national project over and above the Islamic project, it literally destroyed the power that Turkey will never be the same again. Or it could be, we don't know, Allahu A'lam, maybe in the future. But it suffered majorly. Nationalism was one of the biggest things that destroyed the Ottoman Empire. Because they put the national identity above and beyond the religious one. It was the biggest mistake they made in their life. In the 15th and 16th and 17th century, Turkey was equivalent to the USA in power. Now it's not even equivalent to Japan, sorry to say. It's a strong nation, yes, but it's nowhere near what it was before. Nothing compared to it. Islam gave every nation that ever embraced it its highest successes, full stop, period. If the Arabian Peninsula did not have Islam inside of it, what would it be? They would be the least successful civilization in history. Think about it. If Islam did not enter we're doing a bit of counterfactual history here, but if Islam did not enter the Arabian Peninsula, it would be the least successful civilization in human history. Sand dwellers, the people, barefooted people, jahil. They know a bit of poetry and they fight each other. That's it. That's what the Arabs would have been. It would have been the most failed people in history. The fact that Islam came in and they thought of the bigger picture, literally, let's include everybody. This made them one of the most successful civilizations in human history, by the admission of all those who study human civilization. And everything else. Look at the African nations. Mali, one of the greatest, most rich people of all human history, was a Muslim, Musa Mansa. He would never have been given such title if he didn't think of things in Islamic sense. Many of the empires, the African empires, the North African ones, the West African ones, the Central African ones were Muslim ones. The biggest and the strongest of all time. The strongest that Africa has been under Islam. The strongest that the Turks has been under Islam. The strongest the Arabs has been under Islam. And the weakest they have been is when they decided to leave the Islamic identity in favor of the nationalistic one. That's the reality of the situation. That's honestly the truth. And they will not be, and this is the truth. I can see no way that any nation in the world can take on this great superpower, the Europeans and extensions, unless they go back to this. They go back to this. Imagine if you had a country, let's be honest. Imagine if you had a country with Pakistan and Turkey and Egypt and Nigeria. Nigeria is like 60% Muslim. Okay? And all of these countries together. Imagine that country. Just imagine that country. What would it look like? Population of 800 million, this many. That is the new America. All it needs to do is come together. But we are so foolish, and we have been held back by our nationalistic tendencies that it's been the number one deteriorating factor for the Muslim empire and the Muslim people. Imagine if these countries traded together, if they had special deals together. Indonesia is the heartland, the demographic heartland of Islam. The number 2 country in population. Imagine you had a country comprising of Malaysia, Indonesia, Nigeria, or at least a big part of it, Egypt, Turkey, Pakistan, just these countries. I'm not even mentioning all the 50 or 60 Muslim majority countries. Imagine these countries coming together, right? Then we have something else. Aki, I'm saying that honestly, that the national project will be something completely different. Now, I want to finalize this discussion here today with the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay. So the first one is there is no preference of an Arab over a non-Arab. This is, you know, there was one, I had a history teacher. One time he was like, I don't know of any man before such and such a man who was not racist. And he was shouting and screaming. I said, I'm going to leave him. I'm not going to even intervene. But look at this hadith. It's the most anti-racist statement made by any ancient religion, period. You will not find a statement like this in the Bible. You will not find a statement like this in the Talmud, in the Old Testament, the New Testament. In any book, I challenge anyone, and I have challenged them repeatedly for over 10 years. No one has found anything like this anywhere else in any religious book, period. Which is what? He said there is no preference over an Arab over a non-Arab, or a non-Arab over an Arab, or a white person over a black one, or a black person over a white one, except by piety. In fact, all people are from Adam, and Adam is from Turab, really, like dust. This is, subhanallah, like you will not find such a big picture meta ethic on race, ethnicity, and nationality than this. The most harsh the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was ever, and the most harsh language he's ever used was on tribalism. And I'm going to say what he said. When he said, "A'dud henna abik," one of them was being very tribalistic, you know, my lineage, my family. كذكركم آباءكم أو أشد ذكرا. Is it آباءكم أو آبائكم؟ كذكركم آبائكم أو أشد ذكرا. As the Quran says, that these Arabs at the time used to mention their fathers a lot, and you know, too much. It was too much. And Allah is saying you should mention Allah the way you mention your lineage, basically. أو أشد ذكرا, or even stronger than that. But this guy was talking too much, as if like he's better because of where he's from. And the Prophet ﷺ said, why don't you go and bite the penis of your father? أعضد هن أبيك. Go and, hen means penis, ذكر. Go and bite it. Meaning this, you've got nothing to do with that. It's an accident of birth. Yeah, it's an accident of birth. It is an accident of birth that you came from this family or this people, and why are you making it into something else? And look at these other hadith. Do you want to read it? You're the Qari, so you know, mashallah. These ones in bold, please. Man qutila, sorry, taht. We'll get the Qari to read the hadith. The ones in bold. And then translate them if you can as well. Because you've been quite silent today, I'm going to have to get you, you know. And also so I don't make a mistake. Yeah.
قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من قتل تحت راية عمية يدعو عصبية أو ينصر عصبية فقتلة جاهلية.
Okay, can you translate it? There's no translation there.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So whoever dies under a banner supporting nationalism,
yep,
أو ينصر عصبية فقتل جاهلية فقتلة جاهلية, or he aids a banner under nationalism, then he has died a death of ignorance.
Yeah, so this is not necessarily nationalism of modern nationalism. It's asabiyya here is really partisanship based on tribal. I mean, that's what it was. It's partisanship, and in this case, it was based on the tribes. But it can easily be extended. Because if it's a tribe, then really a nation is a major tribe. It's a big tribe. So he's saying that if you fight for your country, yeah, if you fight for your country and you're not fighting for your religion, then you're going to die a death of jahiliyyah. Which is, wallahi al-azim, uqsum billah, I believe this is the reason why we lost the 1967 war in Egypt. It was a humiliating defeat. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the pan-Arabism and this kind of thing. You are fighting for Egypt. Egypt didn't help you, and you didn't help yourselves. But when you fight knowing that you're going to go to Jannah, you can be more courageous. You can go and fight properly. You're not fighting for a nation, a plastic nation that's going to not help you in the grave. You're fighting for a meta-ethic. You're fighting for something deeper. The Prophet explicitly told us whoever fights for their country, i.e. not for Allah, it's not jihad, that's not jihad. You cannot even call that jihad. It is only jihad if you want kalimatullah Allah to be al-ulya. That's only jihad. Where you want Allah's word to be uppermost, that's jihad. Anything else is not jihad. That's not jihad. That's something else. You can call it what you want. And you'll die actually, mi'tat al-jahiliyyah. like as a like pre-Islamic ignorance, the death of someone who died in pre-Islamic ignorance. Meaning you didn't fight for the right reasons, and you didn't die for the right. You died in vain. In fact, can you imagine that? If you're fighting for that reason, so you can be I'm doing it for my country. That's the wrong reason to fight in this religion, for self-defense or otherwise. Can you see the next one? There's another hadith.
Just one word I have to translate it quickly.
Yeah.
I'll go reversal.
Yeah.
Is it this one?
So this is an important factor. Once again, we're not saying you can't love your nation in Islam. You can. You can love your nation. You can love the country. You can love the language. You can love the food. You can love the people. You can love the women. You can love the men. Yeah, I said the women at first. And some people have this proclivities. But what I'm saying is that's not a problem. The problem is when you make that higher than Islam. If that becomes higher than Islam, that is almost verging on kufr. It is almost verging on. You have to erase that. We have to reorient that. Okay, ready? I don't know. Does anyone know?
Since while he's doing that,
Yeah.
just the point I was thinking about just came to my mind now. Like, you know, you were mentioning the ayats from like one last time, like, you know, from his signs is that you have these differences in your skin colors and your languages and that type of thing. And a lot of this stuff goes back to Tawheed, isn't it? It's about everything being for Allah. And so like you were saying with jihad, like when you're fighting, if you're fighting for other than Allah, then it's a mistake. Similarly, if you have these things like, you know, differences in your skin colors, tongues, that type of thing, which is, those are signs, like signs are supposed to point towards things. They're supposed to point towards Allah.
Exactly.
So when somebody takes those things and uses it to point towards their own ego, to walk around and to say, you know, I'm this and I'm that.
Because I come from this lineage.
Yeah. You're not giving Allah the haqq that He deserves in creating those things and, you know, enriching the human experience in that way.
And you should, and by the way, I just want to mention something important. We should be aware of our lineage. I mean, it's not a bad thing to be aware of your lineage. I'm very bad at that. I don't even know past my granddad. I don't know anyone. Yeah, unfortunately. We should know our lineage. The Sahaba, they knew who their lineage was. The ones who were connected to the Prophet, they knew that they were connected to the Prophet. There's nothing wrong with any of that. Yeah, it's maqasid sharia and nasl and so on, to know who your father is in particular, but that can be extended, right? However, if you think you're superior on the basis of that, that's what the problem is. And there's another important factor, which is that if anybody, you know, when people sometimes curse Arabs, and this is a very dangerous thing, not because I'm Arab, because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was Arab. This can actually lead to kufr. And some scholars said it is kufr. You'll be surprised. There's some very heavy statements on this. Because anything which the Prophet is, you cannot attack. Like you'll find some feminists extreme to say, I hate all men. Well, the Prophet was a man. I hate all Arabs. The Prophet was an Arab. He was an Arab. He had a lineage which was Arab. And there are some nations in particular which have antagonistic attitudes towards Arab people. For example, Iran. They have antagonistic, not all of the Iranians, not all the Farsis, but you know them. You've seen them. The nationalists. They'll say, you know, I was in a barber. I told you the story. And they knew that because it was an Arab barber, actually. And there was an Iranian guy sitting next to me in the chair. And he started bashing Arabs, smashing them. I said to him, and then I realized that, you know, he was very angry at the conquest, you know, the Islamic conquest into Persia. I said to him, listen, you know, this and that, and we went into a discussion. But the point is that, you know, the Prophet ﷺ was Arab. He was. And he had a lineage going back to Adnan, at least that we know of, and going back to Ibrahim, alayhi salam. So this is an important lineage. And Allah, He chose that for the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He chose that lineage for the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He didn't choose any other lineage. And it was the attitude of Bani Israel, not all of them, but some of them. Obviously some of them became Muslim as well. But some of them that we can't accept this man as a prophet because he's Arab. That was the reason. Look at Safiya bint Huyay. Her father, Huyay bin Akhtab. Yeah? He didn't accept the Prophet ﷺ, and he hit his own daughter, who then became, ironically, the Prophet's wife, because of the dream that she had, which is that she saw the sun coming into her lap in the Hadith. And that dream, he knew what it meant. He was a dream interpreter. He knew it meant that there's going to be a prophet that's going to come from their tribe, not ours. And he did a full tafsir of the dream. And so he was very upset. You'll see even in the Old Testament, to this day, the way they describe Arab people, or in fact the lineage of Ishmael, like wild donkeys and stuff like that. You can see the ghil and the anger and the resentment they have. Because it is like a competitive tribe. They both come from Abraham, right? We can't have that attitude. We don't have that attitude with them. We don't have that attitude with anybody from Bani Israel. In fact, when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu when some of the women, the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, were disparaging Safiya bint Huyay, what did he say? He said, tell them that I am from the same lineage as Harun and Musa. Harun in particular, I think it was actually. So he was saying, my lineage is the same lineage as the Prophets. That's why we have to be careful. Some people have very ethnically Jewish ideas. What can be referred to nowadays as anti-Semitism. This is not actually allowed, because the Prophets came from that line. Well, we say all these Jews are. What we talk about when we say Jews, Bani Israel. Well, Jesus was that, Moses was that, David was that, Solomon was that. We all believe in those prophets. We can't attack these sacred lineages. Yeah, go ahead, please.
قال عمرو سمعت جابر بن عبد الله رضي الله عنهما قال كنا في غزاة قال سفيان مرة في جيش فكسع رجل من المهاجرين رجلا من الأنصار فقال الأنصاري يا للأنصار وقال المهاجري يا للمهاجرين فسمع ذاك رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال ما بال دعوى جاهلية قالوا يا رسول الله كسع رجل من المهاجرين رجلا من الأنصار فقال دعوها فإنها منتنة.
So can you translate?
Yep. So a man from the immigrants, so from the Muhajirin, kicked an Ansari man. The Ansari man said, "Oh Ansar, help!" And the Muhajiri said, "Oh the Muhajirin, the immigrants, help!" Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam heard and said, "What is this?" Which is a characteristic of the period of ignorance. They said, "Oh Allah's Messenger, a man from the Muhajirin kicked one of the Ansaris." Allah's Messenger said, "Leave this call. For indeed it is a detestable thing."
Beautiful. And so what does this show?
Well, obviously this shows that instead of thinking about their tribes or where they're from, they should be taking into consideration the bigger ban of Islam, right?
Yeah. And Sabur, you know that thing that you told me about, his name is Ross Rogers, was his name, I don't know. Yeah. Was he the one who made the point about the fact that Islam became as successful as it is because of this meta tribe that he called the Ummah, and this guy who was can you tell us about that a little bit?
I can, but not right now, because you're mixing two different things.
Okay, fine.
Fine. I'd rather use references, but
fine.
I mean, the book is Generalship of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and he wrote about the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's brilliant military mind, what he did. He created the super tribe, the Ummah, but I don't want to misquote him, so for everybody else, they can read the book. But you'll definitely read it and see that how could basically a man in the desert without military training, without going through what Napoleon went through, could be a source of military study in history, that historians are actually studying him. And that's why he is the greatest general from an Islamic perspective. And all of the generals that subsequently came after him, so Khalid bin Walid or Umar Mukhtar, they would be disciples of him. So it's an amazing way of looking at it. But there's other books as well. Which
I think a lot of people, you'd agree that you've read a lot of these things, these titles and stuff. They talk about the fact that the great success of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has been because of his the fact that he was able to merge all these tribes into one.
Yeah, so there's the whole discussion about how he made this super tribe.
Yes.
Right? So in Arabia, your tribe, like if you imagine you got Arsenal, right? So you got Arsenal playing, who's their rivals? I don't know much about football. Who? Tottenham.
No, the rivals are London Tigers, actually. Right.
So you got Arsenal, right? And imagine Arsenal just lost the match against Tottenham, and it's just the last minute. At that point, a Tottenham fan in the middle of the Arsenal fans raises up his flag, right, or his T-shirt or whatever of that team. You can imagine the reaction, right? You can, and imagine if they're all drunk, right? The Arabian Peninsula was more tribalistic than any football fans today, and in that, the Prophet ﷺ managed to, from all these tribes, create a new identity which had nothing to do with ethnic background. So yeah, there's some really amazing things.
And this is coming from people that are antagonistic towards Islam and they don't have a favourable or charitable understanding of it.
Depends on the author, but Ross Rogers is looking at it from an academic point of view. There are others who are actually anti-Islam, and they've said amazing things. But we have to understand, they'll also criticize him militarily on certain things, but we believe in those things because of revelation. But they're using today's standards of military genius. They would say, well, he could have done his supply line like this, or he could have done that. But we know that these things are subjective even in military circle and in terms of academic discussion. So in these books you find positivity and negativity in terms of his military analysis, but overall you do find, just like Napoleon, just like other historical figures, that he is a person of major interest in history because it was the most successful empire in human history.
Fantastic. I think you should definitely do a video on this, by the way. I'll join you and ask you some more questions on your channel. Thank you for coming today, by the way. And that will be it for today. We've covered a lot of ground. I think we've covered a lot of ground. We've defined the nationalism, we've defined the problems with it, we looked at the major arguments for and against it, and then we looked at the Islamic stance on it more in depth, and this has been the last session. So I'm going to say this not just about the episode, but about the entire series, that with this we conclude. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.